Okay, so the new Tone King Imperial preamp has been out for a few months, and if you've seen any of the reviews, you may have seen some criticisms around the level of kind of bass and low ends, especially on the rhythm channel. And I've done a few videos on it, and a lot of those criticisms are valid. There is a lot of low end, especially on that channel, especially as you push the gain. And it's not insurmountable. You can definitely tweak the EQ settings to get a good tone. Obviously, you could always swap IRs, and that can help as well. But I've also seen some comments out there saying that there's a plan to address some of these issues via a firmware update. And given this a two preamp pedal, I wondered how much can they really affect this via a software update? And that got me thinking about, hey, let's test out a few scenarios and see if we can figure out, to what extent can they address this. But before we dive into that, I think it's important to talk about, what are the parts of this preamp pedal? And I'm going to put a diagram up here on the screen. And basically at a high level, the guitar signal comes in, and the first thing is you've got that tube preamp circuit. It's the same circuit as from the Imperial amp. And it's got, you set your volume or your gain level. You've got your EQ tweaks, whether that's the high-low on the rhythm channel or the mid-bite and tone control on the lead channel. You've got your attenuation control. You've got your reverb settings and your tremolo settings. All of that's built into this kind of preamp section. And then typically that preamp section runs into a power amp emulator and then the IR, and then you go out to an interface. However, you can also, via the send jack, and this is if you want to use this preamp kind of a 4-cable method with a real tube amp, and run this preamp into the effects loop return on another tube amp, and use the power amp of that amp. So that means that send is skipping the power amp emulation and the IR, and is only using that analog tube circuit up front. And so I thought it would be worthwhile to compare the tones of using the whole pedal, meaning with the power amp emulation and the IR, and also try to use it with just using the preamp section of this and using the IR from somewhere else. And in this case, the somewhere else is my quad cortex. So what I've got set up is I'm using both inputs of the quad cortex. I've got the main output on the preamp pedal, meaning with the power amp emulation and the IR, to input 2 on my quad cortex. And I'm just using it as a pure interface. And then I've got the send, which is only sending the preamp signal. I'm sending that into input 1 on my quad cortex, and I'm going to do the IR and maybe even a power amp emulation on the quad cortex. And the goal here is to compare the two, and if we assume that any software update they do can't affect the preamp tube circuit, which I don't think it could, the only thing a software update could do is affect the power amp emulation or the IR process. And I think it might be worthwhile to take those out of the loop, so to speak, compare them, and see if making updates to those really might fix this low end issue. And so if we look here, like I said, I've got this preset set up to where input 2 is doing nothing. It's really just, it's an interface, it's going out. Input 1, I'm going to first just run it through an IR. And the way I've got this set up is I'm running the same exact IR on both devices. So I'm using this Fender 2x12 IR that's from Amalgam. I've loaded that onto the Tone King Imperial preamp pedal, and that's what it's using. And we can see that here. It's this Fender 2x12. And then maybe later on, we'll add in a power amp section on the quad cortex and see if that makes a difference. But for right now, we're only going to run an IR. And if we look here on the Imperial preamp, I've got obviously both channels available to me. I have the high frequency compensation off on both channels, and I'm also not using this low pass filter either. I think I'm going to leave those off. Interestingly enough, I think those settings are part of the power amp emulation. So it could be that something like that, or maybe an additional high pass filter or something like that in the power amp emulation might be how they're going to address this. but we're going to leave those off for right now. Maybe we'll play around with a high frequency compensation later on, but for now we're going to leave them off. I've got the reverb on the Tone King Imperial preamp pedal, so what you hear in terms of reverb is coming from the pedal, and I'm not using any other pedals in front of the preamp. So we're just going to compare how it sounds. So let's start off with the rhythm channel, and you can't see this here on the app, but the way I've got this set is I've got the gain about halfway, I've got the attenuation, all the way up, so we're not attenuating at all, and I've got the bass at about 1.5, and I've got the treble at about 8.5. So that's my kind of standard setup for the rhythm channel, and it sounds like this. So a nice tone. It's still pretty dark, even with the bass really low and the treble really high. Let's go ahead and we're going to switch over. And now we're only using the preamp section of the pedal, and we're running into an IR that the quad cortex is using. So they don't sound that different. But let's try cranking up the gain on the rhythm channel, because I've noticed on the rhythm channel, the more gain you give it, the more you push the level, the more that low end issue kind of comes across. So I'm going to tweak the pedal right now, and I'm going to push the gain all the way up to 10, and I'm going to bring the attenuation down to kind of compensate for that volume increase. Okay, so we've got the gain at 10. I brought the attenuation down to about 5, and I've still got the bass and treble set, at 1.5 and 8.5 respectively. And here's what it sounds like using the whole of the TK preamp pedal, meaning with the power amp emulation and the IR. So you can hear the low end, even with the bass really low, is pretty flubby. If we switched to use the preamp section only, and then use the IR on the quad cortex, it does sound like it gets a little clearer. Here's the whole pedal with the power amp emulation and everything. So there's definitely a difference there, and it does give me some hope that maybe they can tweak that power amp emulation to tighten up some of that low end a little bit. Let's go ahead and I'm going to turn on the power amp emulation. Now this is an EL34, so not necessarily the right kind of tube with a Fender style amp, but I've had good results with this specific capture of a EL34 power amp on the quad cortex. I've used it on many different presets, and so we're just going to stick with kind of what I know. And so if we add that in, you can hear adding in that power amp emulation just adds a little bit of, I think, needed character to the signal. Just running straight from the preamp into the IR, I think, lacks something. When you add this power amp emulator, I think it adds a little bit of life to it. Compare that to the Tone King pedal, which has its own power amp emulation. There's enough there that I'll even drop the treble a little bit and raise the bass on the EQ settings. So this does give me hope that there's the potential for a software update that'll tweak that power amp emulation, solve some of those low-end issues. Let's play around with the high frequency compensation. First off, let's see if it applies to the preamp at all. So I'm going to stay in preamp only mode. And let's go ahead and turn that on. I don't think it has much of an effect if you're not using the power amp emulation. If I go back to using the whole pedal, you can hear you're getting more of that top end. So I do think that that high frequency compensation is part of that power amp block, which means it's part of the simulation, it's part of the software. So I think when they go to tweak this, they might be adding just more of those kinds of features in to shape some of that power amp emulation. So I think for most of this, a lot of the focus should be on the rhythm channel. That's the one that has the majority of these issues. But let's go ahead and switch over to the lead channel and see what kind of difference we get there. So now we're on the lead channel. So in this, I've got the gain about halfway. I've got the attenuator about halfway. I've got the mid mic down a little bit, and I've got the treble up a little bit. It's a nice kind of mid gain to low gain kind of tone. If I go ahead and run that through the power amp and the IR and the quad core, you can hear we're getting a lot more top end there. I would probably even bring down the top end on the pedal. So again, we're getting much more kind of top end from the quad cortex power amp and IR simulation than we are when we're doing it on the pedal. So I think this is a good thing. It tells me that there's potential here to improve some of the low end response on this Tone King Preamp pedal. Now, again, the pedal sounds good. I've been able to get some great tones out of it. I like it a whole lot, but I think if they could make some of these firmware tweaks and adjust some of that low end, I think the pedal could be sounding even better, which just makes me super excited. So if you haven't bought this pedal and you're worried about this low end, one, I would say it's manageable as it is now. But two, there's definitely room for some firmware updates. And if they're already working on that, hopefully that'll come relatively soon. So I hope that helps you. And as always, thanks for watching.